what are my experiences with mental health as a queer person. I have been bisexual all my life, and I have been living with mental illness for about, this is the 11th year, so which makes up most of my adult life. And I have been battling, and particularly because of the mental illness that I have, which is schizophrenia, I have had challenges explaining myself, even to myself, making sense of who I am. I think I've had trouble reconciling those two layers of my identity. But also I have, as someone who believes very strongly in spirituality and ancestral callings and all that, it made it difficult for me to reconcile my mental health and my sexual orientation and my spirituality. I think it's really a challenge when you are told, I think particularly because of the history of the LGBTI community and how we've been pathologized and how we've been considered as a mental ill condition for a very long time. I felt like my being bi was like a sign that this mental illness that I had was, manifesting in that way. And it took me a while. There was a lot of self-hate, and because when you go to the hospital and you look different, already they're like, oh, it's part of their illness. It's because they're ill that they're acting like this. Or when they ask you about boyfriends, or the usual health questions that you're asked, and you have no answer to give, or you have no usual answer to give, it becomes a challenge, because it's difficult to live with both identities, like it's either or. You can't be both. You can't be mentally ill and be queer, because it becomes a reiteration of so many stereotypes and so even within the LGBTI community, you get a lot of stigma, because people feel like maybe you're the reason why people think, like, if you disclose to the public or whatever, then you will be the reason people think people who are queer are not well up there, because apparently if you have a mental illness, you're not complete mentally. Apparently that's what it is. And it took me a while to be able to speak openly and honestly about both my identities, and also as a masculine presenting bisexual woman. It's like it's a can of worms. Like, what, you're bi but you're butch, but how can you be bi and butch? No. So I feel like my whole life was just like this constant opening of cans of worms, or this gigantic can of worms that was constantly open. But my experiences with mental health as a queer person I've been blessed with a supportive workplace. The organization I work for the people that I work with have become like family, because there are times when I've had episodes at work and they've been there to support me, take me to the hospital, take me home, things like that. And it's really, I think working somewhere else would be a challenge for me. If I was to be offered a job elsewhere, it would take me a lot to actually consider leaving, because to establish those relationships again, to start from scratch, explaining that, even though I have not relapsed in over 3 years, there's always that possibility to say, even if you're on medication, stress can trigger, or loss can trigger, things like that. And it's really within the community, it has also, I think generally, I've been that person that wants to destigmatize a mental illness through my actions. So I've seen a lot of people, when I disclose to them that I have a mental illness, and particularly schizophrenia, they're like, but you don't look and sound like a crazy person, you know. And I'm like, no, how am I supposed to sound? Am I supposed to be walking around covered in oil with torn clothes for people to understand that I have a mental illness? I think it's just about, I think my very existence as a person should and is a way of destigmatizing mental illness, and particularly schizophrenia, because a lot of people think that when someone has schizophrenia, they're like a serial killer or something, you know, like their voices telling them to stab everyone in the workshop. I don't know what people think, but you know, it's just a mental illness like any other. It is, however, a challenge to find partners, or a partner, depending. It's like once a person, I always make it a point to disclose to people that, you know, I have a mental illness before, like when we're getting to know each other. And I feel like 9 times out of 10, most of the people I talk to back off and say, nah, not my cup of tea. So it's like a very lonely life. But I've learned to be self-sufficient. I've learned to be complete in myself, and then whoever comes along is there to complement the full person that I am. I think we need that as a community. I think also speaking to the general mental health of everyone, despite an illness, because health is not just the absence of illness. It's the complete fulfillment of the mental state of a person. So I think it's just, there's a lot of stigma and discrimination that goes on, not just within us, but the hurt we find out there is the challenge that also comes in. It translates inward, because it's like we reflect it into ourselves as a community, and it becomes a way of us, how we hurt each other. But I understand that the issue of mental health is very multi-layered, and a lot of people that have challenges with mental health, with their mental health, will not come out and say it. Some of the most bubbly people, some of the most outspoken people have mental health challenges, which they will never speak of until one day we find them having committed suicide, or we just find them crying on the corner of the street and people don't know how to. Because I feel like people always wait for we are a very reactive society, and I think as a community we need to take proactive measures when it comes to mental health, particularly with this COVID, because people have been in isolation, people have been removed from their social circles, people have been without livelihoods. It's a lot to take on, and it becomes a challenge when that support system that you thought you had moves away, you know, is detached from you. There are threats of putting the country back in lockdown, particularly this region of the country, which, I mean, it's perfectly normal, because, you know, numbers are going up, people are getting sick. But what does that mean for people who we're slowly readjusting to some sort of normalcy, to then be forced back into isolation, to then be forced back into, you know, into this existence, not a life. So I feel as a community, but I mean as a society at large, there's a mental health catastrophe that will follow this COVID catastrophe. And I think we need to take very proactive measures to make sure that people's mental health, because even before COVID, people were barely coping. So now imagine, and those that were coping with very detrimental and hazardous means, the use of drugs, the use of narcotics, the use of alcohol, or rather abuse. And it's really a challenge to say, how then do we move forward as a community to make sure that we are all mentally healthy, to make sure that we are all there for each other effectively, because it's not just being there for each other that matters, but effectively being there for each other. I think it's very crucial. And yeah, that's what I think. Those are my thoughts. Don't know if